Welcome back to the table. This episode is supported by MK Army Heal Energy, a founding partner of the Roundtable for Men, built for long days and real work. Fuel the fearless. Last week we talked about anger and exhaustion, and how a majority of time they coexist with each other. How lashing out affects everyone in your life. How exhaustion is the reasoning behind our anger, but not the excuse of what we did. We talked about things that cause the exhaustion, like work, finances, home life, stress, mental anguish, and how it impacts you and those around you. This week is going to be a little bit different. It's going to ask you to look inward and really think about who you are. Most of us spend our entire lives collecting titles: husband, father, provider, employee, boss, coach, leader, business owner. And all those roles matter. They're important. They're responsibilities that we should take seriously. But somewhere along the way, a lot of men stop seeing themselves as a person and start seeing themselves as a collection of responsibilities. Everything becomes about what needs to be done. Everything becomes about who depends on us. Everything becomes about the role we are supposed to fill. And eventually, a lot of men find themselves asking a question they never expected: who am I anymore? Because when you've spent years defining yourself by your responsibilities, it's easy to forget who you are beneath them. It's easy to look at the titles you've earned and convince yourself that those titles are your identity. But what happens when the roles change? What happens when the job ends? When the kids grow up? When life looks different than it does today? That's what we're talking about today. Who are you beneath the roles? So come on in, get comfortable, and pull up a chair. Most of us don't wake up one day and decide to lose ourselves. It happens slowly, one responsibility at a time. When we were kids, we're just about ourselves. We don't think about titles. We don't think about status. We don't think about what we provide. We just exist. We figure out what we enjoy, what we're interested in, what makes us laugh, what makes us curious, what makes us dream, and then life starts adding responsibilities. First, we're students, then employees, maybe eventually a husband, a father, a provider, a coach, a leader. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. Those roles matter. They're important. They're responsibilities that should be taken seriously. A good husband should take pride in being a good husband. A good father should take pride in being a good father. A good provider should take pride in taking care of his family. The problem isn't the roles. The problem starts when the role becomes the entire identity. I remember when we found out my wife was pregnant with my oldest. And one of the things that I'll never forget is my grandma somehow knew before we did. To this day, I don't know how. We hadn't told anyone because we didn't know ourselves yet. We had only been together for a couple months at that point. But she asked my wife a question that made it sound like she already knew. And at the time, we just laughed it off. Then a couple weeks later, we found out she was right. Looking back now, especially after she passed away, it's one of those memories that has just stuck with me. Because that was the moment that everything started to change. Not just because we're having a baby, but because I was about to become responsible for another human being. Overnight, my priorities changed. Everything became about being a father. Now, I'm going to be honest, I wasn't at my best in the beginning, partially because I was immature and irresponsible, but also because I was scared. I was focused on all the things that I thought I needed to become: a provider, a protector, a father, a husband, and those things are all important. But looking back, I think that's when I first started to understand how easy it is to lose yourself inside a role. Because once that responsibility arrives, it never leaves. Every decision starts getting filtered through that responsibility. Every dollar, every hour, every choice. And before long, you're not thinking about what you want anymore. You're thinking about what your family needs. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of being a man. That's part of being a father. But if you're not careful, years can go by and you'll realize You've become so focused on that role that you've forgotten about the person carrying it. And I think that's where a lot of men find themselves. Not because they don't care, not because they're bad husbands or bad fathers, but because they spent so much time becoming what everyone else needed that they stopped asking themselves who they were and what they needed. Because at some point, men stop asking who they are and start defining themselves by what they do. And when that happens, something begins to change. You stop introducing yourself as a person and start introducing yourself as a role. You become the guy who works construction, the guy who owns a business, the dad, the coach, the manager, the provider. And before long, those titles become the only way you see yourself. Not because you planned it that way, but because life gets busy. Responsibilities grow. People depend on you. And little by little, the person underneath the responsibilities gets pushed further and further into the background. Not because he's gone, but because he's buried underneath everything else. For a lot of men, life eventually becomes about responsibility. Wake up, go to work, pay the bills, take care of the family, handle the problems, go to sleep, wake up and do it all over again. And there's honor in that. There really is. Because somebody has to carry the weight. Somebody has to make sure the lights stay on. Somebody has to keep the roof over your family's head. Somebody has to make sure the family is taken care of. The problem is that after enough years of doing that, survival becomes the only thing you know. You stop making time for yourself. The hobbies disappear. The interests disappear. The friendships disappear. And I think work is one of the easiest places to see that happen. Most of us start working because we want freedom. We want money. We want independence. We want to begin building our own separate life. And in the beginning, work is just something we do. But over time, for a lot of men, work starts becoming who they are. And I know there have been times in my life where work wasn't just a job. It became my focus. I was thinking about work at work. I was thinking about work when I got home, thinking about work when I was supposed to be relaxing, especially when I was an assistant general manager at Taco Bell. And before long, it felt like my entire life revolved around responsibilities. And it isn't just work, it's bills, it's appointments, it's school events, it's practices, it's games, it's grocery runs, it's fixing things around the house. It's because it's everything that comes with being an adult. And after enough years of that, you stop making time for things that don't feel necessary. Not because you don't enjoy them, but because there never seems to be enough time. The goals that you once had get pushed further and further down the list. Not because they weren't important, but because everything else felt more urgent. And eventually you look around and realize you haven't done something purely because you enjoyed it in years. Everything has a purpose, everything has a responsibility attached to it. Everything is about what needs to be done. And somewhere along the way, you become so focused on taking care of everyone else that you forget you're someone worth taking care of too. A lot of men don't even realize it's happening because they're too busy being needed until one day they realize they don't know themselves anymore. I want you to think about a few questions. What do you enjoy? Not what pays the bills, not what your family needs. What do you enjoy? What excites you? What are your goals? What makes you happy? What would you do if nobody expected anything from you for a day? Honestly, if you asked me this question a few years ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer because I had forgotten who I am and what I love to do. I became so focused and wrapped up in being a provider, in being a father, and in being a husband and rock for my wife that I lost who I was. Now, as a stay at home dad, I'm slowly learning what I love again. I'm watching the UFL, which is spring professional football. I'm watching my Spurs battle the Knicks in the NBA Finals. I'm starting to get back into gaming. but I'm still focused on being the best father to my children and husband to my wife. Ever since I graduated high school in 2010, I have always put work first. I've missed Super Bowls. I've missed playoff games. I've missed everything in between because that's who I was. It's who I have been up until recently. When I've been able to switch my focus back to being home, to being present with my kids, I'm relearning who I am. And that's the biggest part of all of this. I'm relearning who I was before my wife and before my kids and before the responsibilities that came with becoming an adult. For some men, these questions are easy. For a lot of men, they're incredibly difficult. Not because they don't have the answers, but because they haven't thought about those answers in years. They've spent so much time focusing on their responsibilities that they've forgotten how to think about themselves. Ask a man what he does, and he'll answer immediately. Ask him about his job. His responsibilities, his family, his obligations, and he'll have no problem answering. But ask him who he is, and suddenly the room gets quiet. Because a lot of men can tell you what they do, very few can tell you who they are. And that's not because they're shallow, it's because they've spent years defining themselves through responsibility, years defining themselves through performance, years defining themselves through output. So eventually, they stop seeing themselves as a person and start seeing themselves as a function. The reality of things is that every role changes eventually. Every single one. Jobs change, companies close, people get laid off, retirement comes, kids grow up, children move out, marriages can end, injuries happen, life changes. And when those things happen, a lot of men experience something they've never expected. It's an identity crisis. Because the thing they built their entire identity around is suddenly gone. The guy who spent 30 years working suddenly retires and doesn't know what to do with himself. The father who spent 20 years raising children suddenly finds himself in an empty house. The business owner loses the business. The athlete suffers an injury. The husband goes through a divorce. And suddenly the question appears, who am I now? I remember experiencing a version of this myself when I left the Army. And I truthfully wasn't in the Army more than a year. For a brief period of my life, being a soldier wasn't just something I did. It was part of how I saw myself. It influenced how I carried myself, how I approached challenges, how I viewed responsibility. And then one day, I wasn't in the Army anymore. Suddenly, I wasn't getting up for formation. I wasn't putting on the uniform. I wasn't surrounded by the same people every single day. I wasn't living that life anymore. And when I lost the Army, I was devastated. I felt like I lost everything that mattered. And to this day, I've been fighting to get that back through 3 failed attempts to get back in. And when something has been part of your identity, even for a relatively short period of time, losing it can feel strange. Because even when you choose to leave, there's still an adjustment period. There's still a transition. You have to figure out who you are outside of that role. What parts of you what parts of that experience are still part of you and what parts were tied to the position? I think that's something a lot of men experience throughout life. Maybe it isn't the military, maybe it's a career, maybe it's a marriage, maybe it's becoming an empty nester, which I'm not looking forward to in my future. Or maybe it's just an injury that ends something you love. But eventually, life changes. And when it does, you're forced to answer that difficult question: who am I now? Because when your identity is built entirely around a role, losing that role can feel like you're losing yourself. That's why so many men struggle during major transitions. Not because we are weak, not because we are incapable, but because we never built an identity outside the responsibility. The role changed, and we don't know what's left. And sometimes the answer isn't becoming someone new. Sometimes the answer is remembering pieces of who you already were. Think about who you were before marriage, before kids, before the career, before responsibility took over every single corner of your life. What interested you? What excited you? What dreams did you have? What passions did you have? What friendships mattered to you? Now, I'm not saying you need to go back and become that person again. Life changes, people grow, responsibilities matter, but there is value in remembering pieces of yourself that still matter. When I think about this, I find myself looking back at different stages of my life. Being born in Colorado, growing up in San Antonio and in Austin, my high school years, my early adult years. And when I look back, I realized there were things I enjoyed long before I became a husband or a father. Sports were a huge part of that. Being around football, being part of a team, building friendships, being connected to something that was bigger than myself. At the time, I wasn't thinking about identity. I was just enjoying life. I was spending time with people, creating memories, chasing interests, chasing dreams, doing things that excited me. And what's interesting is that when I look at the roundtable today, I can still see pieces of that younger version in myself. The desire to build a community, the desire to bring people together, the desire to create something meaningful. It just looks different now. I'm not standing on a football sideline. I'm sitting behind a microphone. But some of the same values are still there. Some of the passions are still there. They never disappeared. They just got buried underneath years of responsibility. The guy who loved music, the guy who loved sports, the guy who wanted to travel, the guy who enjoyed creating things, the guy who dreamed big. Those pieces don't have to disappear. You don't need to become who you were, but you shouldn't forget him either. Because some of the things that made you who you are still matter today. They've just been buried underneath years of responsibility. One of the biggest lies a lot of men believe is that their value comes entirely from what they provide. That if they aren't producing, they aren't valuable. That if they're not earning, they aren't important. That if they aren't useful, they don't matter. But that's not true. Your value is bigger than your output. Your family benefits from your paycheck, but they need more than just your paycheck. They need your presence. They need your character. They need your integrity. They need your leadership. They need your compassion. They need your faith. They need your friendship. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately as a father. Because one of the things I've realized is that my kids aren't going to remember every bill I paid. They're not going to remember how every hour that I worked. They're not going to remember every stressful day I had trying to make ends meet. What they're going to remember is whether I was there. They're going to remember whether I showed up, whether I listened, whether I played with them, whether I encouraged them, whether I made them feel loved. And that's not me saying providing doesn't matter. It absolutely does. A father should be providing for his family. A husband should help take care of his household. Those responsibilities are important. But if all I ever give my children is a paycheck, I've missed something. Because children don't just need provision, they need presence, they need guidance, They need encouragement. They need someone who is actually there with them. And I think sometimes as men, we put too much pressure on ourselves to provide that we forget the people we love need more than what we can buy. They need us. Because when people think about the men who impacted their lives, they rarely talk about income. They talk about how they were treated, how they were loved, how they were led, how they were encouraged. The difference between being useful and being valuable is important. Useful is what you do, valuable is who you are. Your family benefits from what you provide, but they remember who you are. Let's strip everything away for a moment. Imagine the job is gone, the title is gone, the paycheck gone, the position gone, the responsibilities gone. What's left? What do you believe? What do you stand for? What kind of man are you? How do you treat people? How do you respond when life gets difficult? What legacy are you building? And honestly, one of the reasons I started the roundtable was because I found myself asking some of the same questions. Not necessarily because I had all the answers, because I don't, but because I realized I was trying to figure some of this out too. Figure some of this out too. Who am I beyond being a husband? Who am I beyond being a father? Who am I beyond the jobs I've worked? Who am I beyond the responsibilities I carry every day? Because eventually, all of these things change. Jobs change, careers end, kids grow up, life moves forward. And I started to realize that if my entire identity was tied to those things, I was always going to feel lost whenever one of them changed. The more I've worked on this show, the more I've realized that what matters isn't the title, it's the man carrying the title. The kind of man I want to be is someone who shows up for people, someone who keeps his word, someone who treats people with respect, someone who leaves things better than he found them, someone who is willing to have difficult conversations instead of hiding and avoiding them, someone who continues growing even when it's uncomfortable. And when I think about legacy, I don't think about money. I don't think about status. I don't even think about achievements. I think about impact. I think about my children. I think about the people I've met. I think about the people about whether I've helped someone feel less lonely. I think about whether I left a positive mark on the people around me. Because at the end of the day, that's what I'm trying to build with the roundtable. Not just a podcast, not just a brand, not just a business, but a place where men can have real conversations. A place where men can learn, a place where men can grow, a place where men can pull up a chair and know that they belong. Maybe that's part of my answer. Maybe that's part of who I am beneath the roles. Because those questions matter far more than most of the titles we spend our life chasing. The important things about your life and about you aren't found in your title. They're found in your character. They're found in your values. They're found in your integrity. They're found in how you treat the people around you. Those things remain even when the roles change. Those things remain even when life changes. Those things remain even when the titles disappear. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the goal isn't to stop being a father, a husband, a provider, or a leader. Maybe the goal is simply remembering that those are the roles you carry and they aren't the entirety of who you are. At the end of the day, there is nothing wrong with being proud of your roles. Being a husband matters. Being a father matters. Being a provider matters. Those responsibilities matter, but they were never meant to replace who you are. Because eventually, jobs change, kids grow up, careers end, titles disappear. And when that happens, you still have to live with yourself. So maybe the question isn't, what do you do? Maybe the better question is, who are you beneath the roles? Because when everything else is stripped away, your character, your values, your relationships, and the impact you have on others are what remain. And maybe that's who you really are. Thanks for pulling up a chair today. I'll see you next time on the Roundtable for Men.